Scott Davis was really never a typical murder suspect. He was a 24-year-old graduate student when he met 19-year-old Megan Lee. At the time, he was running for county commissioner at only a young 24 years old, and he had just finished getting his MBA. His father is Dr. Dave Davis, a prominent Atlanta forensic psychiatrist who made a lot of media appearances profiling criminals. So, very well known, very established, very prominent. Scott and Megan dated for 5 years, but in her own words, it was a rocky relationship. Here's what she had to say. We broke up a lot during our relationship. It was always initiated by me. I just kept on feeling we weren't really connecting in the way that I wanted to connect. After every breakup, Davis would beg for another chance, and often he would do it in writing, and it worked. So eventually, these two, Dave and Megan, got married. A European magazine featured their wedding with a photo spread and called the event the perfect American wedding, Hollywood style. Professionally, Scott Davis's star was rising as a technology consultant, but his personal life was in trouble. And this educated, driven son of the wealthy, famous forensic psychiatrist succumbs to his own wrath as the controlling, jilted husband. The sin? Wrath, defined as an intense feeling of resentment or hatred that leads to a desire for vengeance. Wrath can be defined as an uncontrolled feeling of anger, rage, and even hatred. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Wilcott. As a TV anchor, a judge, and a trial lawyer, I would say almost all of the cases I've covered over the years intersect with one of the seven deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. The opposite of the seven heavenly virtues. Temptations that, when taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we break down the case of Scott Davis and how the deadly sin of wrath turned a driven, successful son and husband murderous. A little later, I'm joined by Sheryl McCollum in our breakdown segment, where we go deep into the how and the why in one of the biggest cases of the 20th century that still lives on today. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly Seven. Buckhead in Atlanta, Georgia, is home to the rich and the famous. It's long been considered as Atlanta's most fashionable neighborhood. It's known for showcasing trendy spots for shopping and for dining. And the neighborhood itself is filled with magnificent mansions and historic homes. Perhaps it's these qualities that drew multimillionaire David Coffin to move from Connecticut to Buckhead. He came from a wealthy family who were worth about 23 million from the automotive and aerospace industries. And at 41, he moved to Buckhead in Atlanta as an entrepreneur. He was described by most as lovable, down to earth, really good looking, wealthy. So, no surprise, he had a lot of women around him. On December 11th of 1996, the Atlanta Fire Department responded to a call about a historic Buckhead home that was engulfed in flames. The house was a two-story house, and a part of the house was completely burnt. Also completely burnt were the two cars in the driveway. The Atlanta Fire Department made a shocking discovery that there was a burnt body inside the home. So, as a result, of course, the homicide unit was called in and they entered that home as soon as the fire was put out. Here's what they found: the victim was lying face down in the kitchen. And the fire department immediately thought this fire was suspicious. They told police that most people would be face up if they were trying to crawl away and get outside of a burning house. The police also found a 9mm gun in the rubble. Of course, it's an elite community in Buckhead, and the news spread quickly about the fire. A woman named Megan Lee was able to tell the police that the house that burned down belonged to her boyfriend, David Coffin. Megan told the police that she had just seen David the day before. She said she and David spoke several times a day, so when he didn't answer her calls, that was unusual. After the police talked to Megan, the police received a phone call that there had been another fire just a mile and a half away from the house that burned down. And the owner of that home was Scott Davis, the same Scott Davis who was legally married to the victim's girlfriend, Megan Lee. Scott told the police that he had been in his bed reading when he heard his dog barking. He said that he then got out of bed and realized that there was a fire at the back of his house. He went outside and he says he saw a man jumping over the fence. Scott said that man shot at him once, so he shot back 5 times with his shotgun. Now, Scott also said that he had previously filed a police report because someone had been inside his home when he got back from the gym. He claimed that the man that had been inside his home was very similar in looks to the man that he had seen set his house on fire. He also said that same man had stolen clothes, a gas can, and tools from his house, and that he had pepper sprayed him as he fled the time that he came back from the gym and found him inside his home. Well, the police were apparently immediately suspicious of Scott and his story, especially when they learned that Scott and Megan Lee were still legally married. They were only separated. Megan and Scott had met while she was a student at the University of Georgia, and Scott, coming from money and his father being a famous forensic psychiatrist, was high on their interest radar. Megan had met David, the victim of the burned down house, once she began the divorce proceedings after 2 years of being married to Scott. Megan had described Scott as being very controlling and that he always reminded her she didn't come from money. Apparently, Scott became very angry when he found out that Megan and David were dating. Scott had called Megan and written her letters begging for her to come back to him. He also warned her against being intimate with anyone else and apparently was furious that she had been with David. Megan told the police that David's home was broken into just 5 days before he was killed. The burglar had stolen some computers, watches, a Porsche, and a 9mm handgun. Now remember, a 9mm Taurus handgun had been found near David's body in his burned down house. Not too long after his car was reported stolen, his Porsche was found in another close by wealthy neighborhood of Brookhaven. The car had been set on fire, but the fire was put out before the car was completely destroyed. The police were focused on Scott as their prime suspect. Scott was again interviewed at the police station. He told them again about the man breaking into his home and about it being the same man he had seen after the fire was set at his home. Scott was also questioned about Megan. Scott claimed he wasn't jealous and that he and Megan had been talking about rekindling things. Scott was also asked about David Coffin, and he let it slip that he had been told that David had been shot. Scott said Megan had told him that, but it was clear to the police that she had no idea that he had been shot. She didn't learn that until much later when the police told her. So Scott then said, oh, it was a friend named Greg that had told him that David had been shot. But the police investigated and found that Greg, too, had no idea about David's cause of death. So Scott says David was shot. Nobody else knew that information other than the police. The police took Scott back to his home after they interviewed him. And when they did that, of course, they also took a look around his house. They were unable to find any shell casings from a handgun, but they did find casings from Scott's shotgun. A neighbor of Scott's would later say she had heard shots only from a shotgun and that she knew this because she was very familiar with guns. Less than 2 days after David's murder, Scott was arrested. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office had to decide whether or not there was enough evidence to actually take the case to trial. They ruled at that time, based on their investigation, they did not have enough evidence. So all charges against Scott were dropped. Years would go by before David's case was reopened. Megan moved to Australia, and Scott had moved to Palo Alto, California. In 2004, fast forward, Paul Howard, the same district attorney that had dropped charges against Scott, started a cold case unit. And Sheila Ross, the assistant DA, reopened David's cold case. The first witness she wanted to interview was Megan. Megan provided her with letters that Scott had written her and messages on her answering machine that Scott had left for her. In those messages, Scott begged Megan to take him back. And once he found out that she had moved on, he wrote that their marriage would never work because she had slept with David. He was angry. He had also hired a private investigator to follow Megan. The PI had provided Scott with David's address just days before David's home was robbed. Scott was the only one who had a strong motive to kill David. It's believed that he went to David's home on December 11th of 1996 and told him to stay away from his legal wife, Megan. On November 23rd of 2005, the case was presented to a grand jury in Fulton County. There was no new evidence presented. It was the same evidence that charges had been dismissed on before. But this time, Scott was arrested in California and brought back to Atlanta. He was charged, the grand jury indictment, with the murder of David. Scott's family put up a $1 million bond, and they did not believe that he did this to David. Scott was free until his trial. Megan came back from Australia to testify. She spoke about her relationship and divorce from Scott, and she also spoke about David and all of the messages that Scott had left her angry that she had moved on and was seeing anyone specifically about David. Now, many now support Scott and say that Megan had lied on the stand. His supporters are also saying that Megan had known about the fire and David's cause of death before they were reported, pointing the finger that she was involved. The criminal trial against Scott lasted 7 weeks, and during the 5th week, Scott's dad told the jury that Scott had been with him on the night of the murder of Dave, the night of the fire. Now, keep in mind, Scott's father had never before this told anyone that he had been with his son. This was the first time this was heard. Clearly, the jury didn't believe him. They did deliberate for 5 days, which is a long time in a criminal trial, but they found Scott Davis guilty of murder, and they sentenced him to life in prison. Scott Davis, this man's uncontrolled anger and wrath clearly to me is what did him in. It's another age-old story in murder and mayhem. He had it all. He was from a wealthy, privileged family. His dad was a famous forensic psychiatrist. This kid was educated. He has MBA, smart, driven at 24, running for a commissioner's office. But it wasn't enough. He just couldn't handle not having what he wanted. He got married. They were still legally married. They get separated, and his wife meets someone else, has a boyfriend. and he really succumbs to his own wrath. He decides, you know what? I'm not going to handle this. He was controlling, he was the jilted husband, and he came up with this really crazy, elaborate scheme to cover up the murder of his wife's boyfriend. It included arson, theft, burglary of his own home, burglary of the victim's home. He was so full of anger and vengeance that I just believe he spiraled out of control and resorted to murder. Let me introduce Mac. Everybody knows you as Mac. Sheryl McCollum. It is beyond my honor and privilege. You have started something that is so significant in our world of true crime, the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute. You are responsible for solving cold cases. And I know you have Zone 7 and you talk about your people and that it's everybody else. But let's be transparent, Mac. It's not everybody else. Your passion, you solve cold cases, your law enforcement. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. But I tell you, if we're being transparent, I can look to my left or my right at many crime scenes, and you've been standing right there. You and I have worked some very significant cases from Delphi to Atlanta. And I appreciate you not just being a part of my Zone 7, but somebody that I can rely on as we're, traversing some of these cases to say, hey, Ashley, am I on the right track? Or what am I missing? Or if we know we're right, how do we still get it to a solve?
That's if you know you're right, how do you get it to a solve? And I love that I can reach out to you and say, okay, let's talk about a case and tell me what you think. Because
Sure.
the instinct, the ability to have looked at so many crime scenes and say, you know what? Yeah, this guy's good for it. Or I don't know, I think they might have the wrong person because of this, this, and this. That
Yep.
is instinct, experience, and so important, and that's why to have you on a case like this that was a cold case and in your stomping grounds, Paul Howard, District Attorney, Fulton County, he's the one that
Yeah.
dismissed this case. He said there wasn't enough evidence. Cold case reopens it. Cheryl, they present the same evidence to the grand jury who then indicts this kid, and then he is found guilty of murder by a jury. But just talk about that piece for a minute. When it becomes a cold case and then gets
Mhm.
reopened, same evidence, grand jury says there's enough, and then it results in a conviction.
Not only did they have the same evidence, they had less evidence because 70 pieces had been lost in that time period. 70, including fingerprints off the
Wow.
victim's Porsche. But let me tell you what they had that second go round. Sheila Ross, honey. And if you want to talk about a
Mm.
cold case, just beast in a courtroom, it is Sheila Ross.
And
She,
she was the head of the cold cases, right? She
that's
led that
right.
division when Paul Howard said, "We need a unit to do cold cases."
That's right.
And tell us more about that because I do think the very first thing she did was interview Megan, the ex-wife of this man. That's the very
Mhm.
first place she started. Tell us about that.
Well, when she works a case, there is nobody better to me when it comes to cold cases. Not only does she understand the law as well as anybody, she presents things in a way that a jury can understand because it's story form. So
Mm.
she'll take the evidence she does have, and then this evidence is weaved into once upon a time. And you're just captivated by what she's telling you because she doesn't just say, hey, the victim had a girlfriend, the girlfriend had a husband, and they were kind of going through a rough time, maybe divorcing, maybe not. No, no, no. That's not what she does. She starts to paint this picture of there's a house engulfed in flames in Buckhead, in a neighborhood, on a street that are $1 million homes. Well, now that's already a different scenario than you're used to hearing. We all hear about house fires, but now you have a man inside that is worth millions
Yeah.
that was dead before the fire started. Okay, now you got me all
Yeah.
day,
Yep, you're
right?
right, but so how does it happen, Cheryl? How do these
Mhm.
why? Like, we're connecting these crimes, these criminals to the deadly 7 because in my experience, it's always connected to one of them, and it just
Yeah.
goes too far, it becomes
Yeah.
murderous, but why? Why? They have everything at their fingertips, or at least that's what people wanna think from the outside,
Mhm.
millions of dollars, they have everything they could want. If I had millions of dollars, my life would be perfect. Well, these are examples of why that's not true.
It's not true. And sometimes, when you've been given everything your whole entire life, you're almost told, "Hey, you're good looking. You've got tons of money. Who would ever leave you?" Well, that starts to resonate. Who in the world would leave this person who could give them the world on a string? Well, he'd never experienced that. And all of a sudden, you have somebody saying, "I'm leaving you, and I have found somebody else that's also worth a little bit of money and is gonna give me the world on a string." Well, I don't think he knew how to handle that because it had never happened. And the closer it came to, not only is she leaving me, here's what it seemed like was the big deciding factor for him. We can be separated, we can be in 2 different homes, but if you sleep with another person, that's it for me. Well, there was a night that Mr. Coffin spent at the wife of the suspect. He stayed there all night long. Well, ironically, that's the night that Mr. Coffin's home was burglarized.
Yeah, ironic. Coincidence or not. Mhm.
Yes, coincidence, and we all believe in those,
Yeah.
y'all.
Yeah.
So, he has things taken from the home like a 9mm, his Porsche, watches, which I'm sure were worth thousands and thousands of dollars. He gets home and he's like, "Okay, somebody's been in here." Well, Mr. Coffin and his best friend automatically know who they think did it. 'Cause he's basically been threatening the whole time, "Stay away from him, stay away from her, stay away from him, stay away from her." So the night that he spends away with her, things are taken that mean something to him.
And he just can't control his anger. Scott
Yeah.
Davis is a little unique to me, Cheryl, because of all the different things he does. That's why the wrath, this intense anger, resentment, and he's out for vengeance because, to your point, that's right. Robs his house, goes back and shoots him, burns him in his house after he shoots and kills him. Then sets fire to his own house to try to cover up and comes up with this story of my house was robbed and I walked in on the intruder when I was at the gym and my house was set on fire. Look, exactly
Yeah,
like happened to David happened to me
exactly.
too. There's a person out there doing all these crimes.
I mean, it's amazing how the 2 crimes were almost exactly alike. So in this house of Mr. Coffin, the house was completely engulfed. It collapsed. It was just
Yeah.
burnt, slapped to the ground. Mr. Coffin was murdered before with a gunshot wound to the head. Over here, nothing of value is taken. The victim is left alive. The fire was started on a rock patio with very little damage. And Mr. Davis had a shotgun where he says he fired at the suspect 5 or 6 times when that person fired at him. Now, here's where it gets a little unusual. You're talking about a shotgun. So typically that's going to be filled with birdshot or buckshot. How do you miss somebody in a tiny little backyard with buckshot? Right?
This is why I love having you on. I'm leaning in. I'm like, this is so good. Tell me more.
Right. Well, it gets better for me because I can go back a little further. The first incident, when he gets home from the gym, a guy in a ski mask comes up to him, has a pistol in his hand, and sprays him with mace in the face. Now, you know, at the academy, when I was hit with OC, it was at the fire department. The hose was right there, and I was still pretty miserable, right? This guy tells law enforcement this happened. The ski mask, the pistol, the mace, okay? Because we all know guys that are gonna show up to kill you also have mace just in case, right?
Right,
So
right. Of
then he
course.
tells them, um, reading a book when my dog starts to bark and I look outside and I see flames and I run out with my shotgun. Stop right there. The last thing I wanted to do after getting hit with mace or OC spray for me was to read. So I would call BS right there. Ain't no way he decided he's gonna read a book.
This is so good. Things I never would think of, the details I would never think of.
Uh-huh.
And to your point, law enforcement has the experience you have to say, yeah, that doesn't make good common sense, this story.
Oh,
Keep going. What else stood out to you?
the lead detective, when he was at Mr. Coffin's house and learned that less than a few miles away, the exact same crime had occurred with the soon-to-be ex-husband, oh, he couldn't ride over there fast enough, sugar. He knew. This no way is what went down. There's no way. So, when you start looking at things and they just don't fit, they don't make sense, you have to look at the most obvious. You're maced. Who is gonna do that? And then say, "Stay away from Megan," and just rush off, but then come back just hours later after murdering somebody and completely destroying their home and taking numerous things of value. Again, none of that happened to you. Why not kill you? You're the husband. To me,
Yeah.
you might be the bigger threat.
Yeah. 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 No, you're right. You're right. And it goes to motive, right? It goes to
Mhm.
the motive. And we all know as a lawyer trying cases, watching cases, analyzing cases, the motive is never an element of a crime anywhere in the nation. No state says motive's element of the crime. But to your point about the cold case leadership in Fulton County, if you can tell a story and weave a motive through, you can convince a lot of juries that person did it. So, in
Sure.
your experience, how important is the motive? And you just talked about law enforcement followed that and said, oh, yeah, he has the motive. How much does that influence an investigation, a conviction, in your opinion?
Listen, the family's gonna wanna know. The first question is why? Why would somebody wanna hurt my mother or my brother-in-law or my neighbor? They're desperate for the why.
Mm,
To a jury, it just helps solidify what you're seeing.
yeah.
Again, why would this man get a bullet in the head and you're maced even though he has a pistol? Well, that tells you right there, these two people cannot be equal in this person's target, in this person's anger. If I'm going to shoot this person in the head and
Hmm.
take things of great value like a Porsche and Rolex watches, and on this one, I don't even really hurt him. I spray him with a little mace and I run off, even though I've got a pistol in my hand also. It doesn't make any sense at
It
all.
doesn't make sense. It doesn't
No.
make sense. And I think it is that common sense piece of it. But here's what always astounds me, and it was true in, let's say, Scott Peterson. We know in his case, a
Hmm.
lot of people believe in his innocence that he still proclaims. Scott Davis says he's innocent still to this day. His family believes him. They
Hmm.
say he's innocent. No way did he do this, Cheryl. So in spite of the evidence
Hmm.
presented,
Let's talk about that.
in spite of your point of it makes no good common sense what he says
Yeah.
happened, boy, his supporters say, "No way did he do this."
Well, let me talk about both those things. First with Scott Peterson. His sister-in-law is very vocal. I don't see his brother.
Not
I don't see friends. I don't
everybody.
see coworkers. I don't see preachers. I don't see old high school friends. I don't see a lot of people coming to his defense.
It's that
I
vocal one, you're right.
It's that vocal one. Now, in this situation, again, let's talk about his daddy. Okay. His daddy was a prominent forensic psychiatrist in Atlanta. Prominent. He knew tons of people at the DA's office. He was well respected. It was not till trial he tried to give him an alibi. Well, that tells me you didn't believe him. And that tells me you knew how this jury was going to go because you tried to save him at the last minute with something that was bogus. He was not at your house.
Wow, you're
If you
right.
believe that he's innocent, you ain't got to lie for him. You just go get the proof and prove it. Now, is it a good look that they lost the fingerprints and didn't run them through APHIS? No, it's not a good look. Does it happen? Yes. Do you still have other evidence that was able to garner a conviction? Clearly.
So you don't believe he's innocent. You think the evidence proved that he did this.
I think the evidence would absolutely take you to his driveway. There's no doubt about it. He's the one that told law enforcement, hey, I didn't shoot him. Nobody told him he was shot. How did he know that information? Only the killer would have known that. He knew it prior to the autopsy. Well, that's not good, and your words will often trip you up, and that's why, for the folks listening to us today, when you get frustrated that law enforcement won't tell stuff like in Delphi, there's a reason, and this is the reason. So that if he now claims something he could not have known, wasn't on the news, Megan didn't know it, law enforcement wasn't even really sure what had happened, but he had knowledge and said, "I didn't shoot it."
And I love it because at first he said, "Oh, Megan told me that," right? My legal wife that I'm separated from, she told me,
Right,
and that didn't fly because she didn't know, and so then he said, "Oh, yeah, it was this other friend who told me." So then he actually tried to keep digging and say, "Oh, yeah, this person told me." Oh, it was that person, neither of whom knew that information.
right.
Mac, tell me this. This happens so often. It's the defendant's own words that really get them convicted at the end. It's that. It's
Yeah.
his saying, "Oh, yeah, he was shot," being the only person to know that outside of law enforcement. Why does that happen? Why do defendants continue, number 1, to speak, but
Yeah.
I guess thankfully really say things that get them caught up and get them convicted?
It's almost subconscious. You're just talking. You're trying to tell your version. You're trying to lead them somewhere. Again, with Mr. Davis, he tells them, "Hey, nothing was really stolen." Then later he tells them, "Oh, a gas can is missing." So he wants them to believe this person came to your house, stole your gas to go set this other house on fire. Like he's leading them too dramatically. I mean, come on. No way. And so if you look at cases like, remember Watts, who murdered his wife and 2 little girls?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
All
yeah,
right,
yeah.
one statement he made is he
In
wanted them
Colorado.
back, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, "I just want them to come home and, they would always rush in the door and barrel rush me." He said, "Barrel." Of all words you could use, of all things you could say, he used barrel.
And for
So
those who don't know about the case, the bodies were found in barrels. That's why
right.
that's significant.
So if you're listening to somebody, you know, you pick out these words, they're choosing that word of all the words in the world. There was a case we had where a young man shot his fiancee in the head, and it was with a high powered rifle, and it left a gaping hole. He kept saying, "I have a hole where she was. I have a gaping hole in my heart." Where I'm like, okay, well, I know what happened to her. Because he kept
Woo!
saying it because he couldn't stop himself.
I don't know
Right?
why I invited you as a guest because now I'm thinking about what have I said because she's listening to every word I'm saying, and there may be some things in there I don't need her realizing I've just said because it's human nature,
Oh,
it
you're so
sounds
funny.
like.
Yeah, but again, you're talking listen, you and I know, and for the purpose of your audience, people are normally killed for 3 reasons: money, sex, and revenge. That's it. So if somebody's not sexually assaulted, you're down to 2. If money was not the intent, so things were not stolen from both houses, you're down to revenge. It's an easy walk. Now, before you get messages from people, yes, there's a 4th one, and the 4th one is somebody is just crazy, okay?
Sure.
That is rare. It is
Yeah.
so rare that you're gonna come across a insane, murderous person. I mean, that's less than 1%. The majority we're gonna work, they're domestic. That's it.
And a lot of people use the language, "Oh, yeah, they're just crazy." Well, that's a word you can't really throw around lightly because to your point, the
Sure.
true mental health diagnoses are gonna be that less than 1%. The rest of these people are crazy because they allowed their personalities or the motive, whether it was the sex, the money, or the drugs, whatever it was,
Mhm.
to take them to a place where they chose to commit these heinous crimes. That's a different
Yeah.
kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty unfathomable, and you go I love that you described how some people who have everything are used to getting everything and expect that they can have everything, and so
Mhm.
I think for Scott, how dare my wife, who he continually was angry with, controlling of, and wanted to remind, "You didn't come from money. You don't have money. I do."
Yeah.
It's that person. How dare she? Everything I've given her, how dare she go have a boyfriend?
Yep.
And I can't even believe it. And then he couldn't control his anger, and he comes up with these elaborate schemes to work through 'em to end up murdering her boyfriend. Why her
Well, let's
boyfriend
talk
and not
about
her?
let's
Oh,
talk
yeah.
about one of the schemes.
Yeah.
One of the schemes was he hired a private investigator to find out where Mr. Coffin lived.
Yeah.
So he was using his money and his status even to locate the victim.
And it was right after that the victim's home was broken into, coincidentally
Shocking.
again.
Yeah, it means nothing. It means nothing. And, and I, again, this is not my wheelhouse, but I would only be able to guess the reason Mr. Coffin and not Megan is because he wanted her. He wanted her back.
Mm.
That was his. He wasn't damaging his own property in any way. I mean, a rock back deck, you can repair that, no problem. He didn't burn his own house down. He didn't steal his own car and torch it. He didn't get rid of his own watches. He did that to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. All right, Cheryl. Any other things that stood out to you about this case and Scott Davis? And again, I would just argue, his wrath. That's what got him carried
Mhm.
away, his intense anger and need for vengeance. He couldn't control it. And he let that take him from maybe a controlling, a bit of an ass to his wife to murder.
Listen, this people love to say, "Oh, they just snapped." It's never that. This
Mm.
is something that's been percolating. He told people, he told her, he called her, he wrote her letters, he called again, he left messages after messages. He got sorry. I'm so sorry, Ashley.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's a real conversation.
He got a PI to track this guy down. He gets gasoline. He gets some type of match or lighter or whatever. He drives over there. He confronts the guy. He murders the guy by shooting him in the head. So he took a loaded weapon as well. He left that weapon behind, which was the victim's own weapon that he had stolen before to complicate the scene. He then goes back to his own house, causes a small fire, makes up this elaborate scheme, doesn't call 911, but calls Megan to tell her, oh my gosh, same thing just happened to me. And then the police rush over there and they're like, this just doesn't fit. They cannot find anywhere on the house or in the trees where somebody shot at him. They can't find shell casings from a 9mm or a 22 or a 38 or anything, but they can see where he shot, his shotgun three to five times, I think. So again, how did this person in a very small backyard not get hit with birdshot or buckshot? How in the world is there not damage to the fence if he did even use a slug? There's no evidence of it. None. There's no evidence that there was a third person anywhere, not in Mr. Coffin's home and not at Mr. Davis's home.
It just makes sense. This conviction just makes sense. So, do people like Scott Davis think that they're going to get away with it?
Yes, he thought he had the perfect crime. And keep in mind, your children, my children, think of our conversation at dinner. Hey, mom, what case you're working on? Hey, what do you think about that trial? Where
All
do you
the
think
time.
the guy screwed up? I mean, my children have heard this was a mistake. This was a mistake. The guy should have never done so and so. Well, a lot of people believe I'm just going to set fire to it and all the evidence will go away. They think bodies will burn completely up in a house fire. They don't. Arson, 99% of the time, is used to cover up another crime.
Yeah.
Quite typically, that person is connected to the victim because if it was a stranger, by setting fire to that house, you're alerting police quicker. So you've got a shorter distance to get away. If you just leave them in the house dead, it may be 3 days. You could be in Acapulco, honey. But if you set that house on fire, you might be 2 miles down the road.
Yeah. Wow, I am fascinated. It's funny talking about kids and our work and having those conversations because I have those
Yeah.
conversations all the time. I just have to tell you real quick, Mac. I don't know if I've ever shared this with you. When my kids were little and I was a trial attorney, I was in court all the time. And so I taught them how to do direct and cross examination so that we would practice at the table. Let me just suggest that that has come back to bite me in my butt
Oh,
because
yeah.
now, right, as teens and older kids, boy, do they use that against me. So we have to be careful about some
Yes.
of these work conversations, but they hear it all. And
Sure.
I'm always flabbergasted that criminals think they're smarter than everyone else, and it's the perfect crime. And I think we could end with there's no such thing as a perfect crime.
There's no such thing as the perfect crime. And I'm gonna tell you something about arson. Arson in strange ways preserves evidence and tells us more about the perpetrator. So go ahead and set fire. It just helps me, honey.
You are phenomenal at what you do. You solve cold cases, you solve everyday cases, and you examine the crime scene better than anyone I know. Sheryl McCollum, Cold Case Institute, you are a phenomenal. Thank you for joining us today to talk about Scott Davis sitting in jail.
Thank you, Judge. And listen, again, I appreciate everything you have meant to me on those scenes. Can't wait to
Thank
work
you.
another one.
Yes, me too.